Kingdom One family, hey, welcome back to another podcast. My name is Nick. I am your host, and this podcast is here to help you become more courageous, healthy, and effective when it comes to ministry. And I have a courageous question for you. Are you training your staff in sexual harassment and bully prevention? I know this is an awkward question, and you might be thinking, Nick, isn't that just for, those unchristians? And isn't that for like liberal Christians? And isn't this type of training the way that the government oppresses our freedom as Christians? The answer is absolutely no. I want to let you know that above reproach is taken directly from the Bible. In Hebrews 13 and 1 Peter and in 1 Timothy, we are called as Christian leaders to live above reproach, meaning we have a life that is free from sinful behaviors, and we are also an example to our church, so that way the church can be an example to the world. If you are not training your staff in sexual harassment and bullying prevention, you are not able to identify those behaviors and not stop them before they reach your congregation. If that sounds like something that you need to get started today, you can email us at academy@kingdomone.co. If you're an HR leader at your ministry, if you are a CEO or a business admin at your Christian school, Christian camp, or nonprofit, know that we want to equip you with the best biblical training so that your staff knows how to identify the behaviors and stop them before they spread through the organization. Again, you can email us at academy@kingdomone.co to get a free voucher, so that way you can preview the above reproach courses and you can see if it aligns with your mission, vision, and values, so that way your ministry can be safe and healthy. Today, we're having a conversation with Cody Bellmeyer. He's an attorney based out of Temecula, California. He's admitted to practice California state law and is a member of the California State Bar. He is qualified to practice before the U.S. districts in both Southern and Central California. He's the founder of Bellmeyer Law, and this firm emerged from his commitment to helping individuals and churches avoid liability and the complexities of the legal system. He hopes to focus his attention and your attention to being proactive in this guidance to prevent litigation and to minimize your legal exposure. Nothing he says should be used as a substitute for legal advice, and we encourage you to seek your own counsel and also consult with Kingdom One when the need for individual advice arises. You can go to his website. We'll have all those links in the description for you. If you want to connect with Cody, here is our conversation that we had. Cody, thank you so much for joining the Kingdom One podcast. So great to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. One of the things that we've talked about before is just the need for legal in ministry, and we know that sometimes those two words feel like they shouldn't be set next to each other. But the reality is ministries do need legal. And one thing we talked about earlier was just how young you are. And so taking advice, legal advice from somebody of your age, can you maybe talk to the audience about how you got started in the legal space and also how you came to be introduced to Kingdom One?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. It's one of those things where, in talking with pastors, they often ask, they go, hey, you're the age of my kid, or, maybe my youth pastor, not to be rude, but why are you here is essentially the gist of it, right? And the reason that is because I just knew what I wanted. I knew what I wanted really early. I graduated high school at 15. I started college at a young age. I was walking myself to college classes before I could even drive. And then by the time I got into my early 20s, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. So I went to a law school, I passed the bar, and my first go, with a really low pass rate for those who know what that pass rate looks like. And then right afterwards, I got involved with a nonprofit, Advocates for Faith and Freedom, which is a great nonprofit that continues to do work throughout the state. We had a unique kind of niche in representing religious organizations, and I got a lot of exposure to representing not only churches there, but private schools, a lot of different types of religious entities. And so without going too far into that, basically got a lot of experience at a young age. And then during the pandemic, after taking a few matters up to the California Supreme Court, in combination with that firm and with Jen Bursch, who's going to become relevant in a second, I went out on my own and decided to make a different mark and help churches on more of a practical level, where we come alongside you not only at the litigation when things are kind of hitting the roof, everything's on fire, everything's going sideways, but really helping churches avoid it and really emphasize that concept of stewardship, right? Instead of paying out the 10, 20,000 on the back end to defend something, let's come alongside you, help you early, help you avoid those altogether, and help you repurpose that money instead of to a bunch of attorneys' pockets into your community, into your ministry, and into your outreach. And so that's really what I do now. I came alongside this because I work with Jen Bursch. She's another general counsel for churches, and we co-counsel on several matters. And she introduced me to Kingdom One, where I actually gave a presentation recently for you guys. That was a good time. And so they put us in contact. I spoke with Stephen over there in great lengths about kind of my passion for the ministry, and he suggested we got on a podcast. So here we are, and that kind of brings us full circle to this moment.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen Bush, for that connection. It's so good. And that was a Grow Together conference. And so we just want to say thank you again for that. That Grow Together conference was great. And just having your representation for legal, really, really awesome. So my next question for you is just as you've talked a bit about your background, when it comes to matters of faith and law, there's some extremities there. And so have you ever seen a ministry rely on something that they heard, whether that's through maybe another attorney or maybe through just, some ways of like the internet or TikTok or something of that nature, and it just didn't hold up in a court of law? Can you maybe talk to us about some of the exemptions that churches think they have that they might not have?
That's fair. Yeah. And so there's TikTok. You mentioned it, and right off the bat, I think it's something I hear once a week. I heard about this on TikTok. Can't I just do this? Or this works in another state, right? You hear it all the time. And certainly from Kingdom One's perspective, I know you guys hear it often from the HR side. Of this worked over here, or I heard this other church, they did this with an employee, and it worked out really well for them. The pastor was thrilled having a bunch of interns under them who weren't really interns, but who were just working for free. You kind of hear the gambit of horror stories, if you will. And so, yeah, I see churches rely on things like that all the time, and rely on things that probably aren't sound legal advice. I think one of my favorite stories about this was I once asked a pastor, I go, so we're having a conversation. I say, why do you think you can do this? Because it was a more of a debate than a conversation, I'll say. I was trying to explain what the law was and how that applied and affected his church. And he goes, well, I think I can do that because we're a church. And I think that's the most common thing I hear is we're a church, or no, that really doesn't apply to us. People don't sue churches. And I think that's one thing that I hear the most, particularly when you're looking at the treatment of staff, job descriptions, things like overtime, and the differences even between volunteer hours versus employment hours. It frequently creates these situations where people think that they're exempt or kind of bulletproof because historically, you just didn't sue a church. You didn't sue your church, right? It was a ministry. You were reaching out. You're building your community. You're not actually looking for a way to harm that church, but that's actually changed nowadays. And we're seeing a huge increase in not only private school litigations, but in church litigations. And I can point in part to COVID for that. I think that there was a change for whatever reason during COVID, maybe and this is speculation only, but maybe a shift in people's viewpoint of churches as they're not there all the time, right? They really did leave the churches or go more remote. And sometimes those interactions make it easier to be more outspoken. And so I think that is one change that I see frequently is the idea that, hey, we're a church, people aren't going to want to sue us, and then they're talking to me. So you can kind of put together the chain of events there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our cultural climate right now is not, the church is not sitting in the best light right now for, various documentaries that have been out that you could see about, pastors. There's been podcasts, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Also, even though it's from a Christian organization, can, position the pastoralship in a very poor light. And so understanding that and where we are culturally, I do think it's even more of a reason to be diligent when it comes to legal matters. And so I know you had a story for us. It was kind of like a very, very sad story of EBS and where things took a wrong turn. Can you maybe talk to the audience about, why legal services matter, specifically in cases where children are involved in VBS, and and protection and things of that nature.
Yeah, and that's a great question. Thank you for reminding me of that. So yeah, one of the I'm going to skew the facts a little bit for confidentiality and obviously for the benefit of the church, and I think any of the listeners would also appreciate that as churches. So I'll start in the broader spectrum of that. Anytime you're involving kids in a ministry, it's important to understand the laws you're working with. Whether that's a private school, whether that's a youth outreach, whether that's just your youth group. Understanding the need for background checks, understanding the need for putting people in positions where they're never alone with children, so that there is that beyond reproach. And then further, just understanding the protection that a waiver could give you when signed by the parents and what a kid can and cannot consent to doing. California is pretty interesting when it comes to consent laws. And so, it's not, I misspoke. It's not interesting. It protects kids in its consent laws. And that's something that I think we can all agree is a good thing. So they can't consent to certain things in a private school setting. They can't consent to searches. In a youth setting, they can't consent to certain activities without understanding the weight. They're in some instances as young as 8. You have these VBSs where kids are doing dangerous events without waivers in place, without these protections, without the parent maybe even knowing what's happening. And the kids certainly can't appreciate the potential lifelong ramifications that may come from that. And we had an incident at a VBS one time where everything went off perfect. It just did. It was a beautiful event. It was serving the ministry. We had, I know from looking into this after the fact, they had a lot of kids who came in from the community who wouldn't have otherwise been there, but they were engaging in an activity that on its face wasn't dangerous, and just due to a series of circumstances became incredibly dangerous. And so, apologies, trying to figure out the line there of attorney-client and wanting to make sure that I'm skewing them appropriately without losing context. All this to say, the children engaged in this activity, and due to those collection of circumstances, a child died. And the parents weren't aware of it, and there wasn't a policy in place on how to respond to it. The response was good. I'll note that. The church did a phenomenal job in the moment of following what its instinct was to respond to that incident. But in retrospect, there probably wasn't a strong enough policy in place to walk through what should happen in that circumstance, who should be getting in contact with police, when the parents should be involved, when the parents should be out there. Was there a liaison when the first responders came to the scene? Was the liaison even on campus at that time? Right? These are the kinds of questions that weren't necessarily thought through in advance. And that's not because, I will note and give the church the benefit of the doubt, no one likes to think about those things, right? In a different context, it's like estate planning. Everyone should have an estate plan, but no one wants to think about their own death, their partner's death, their child's death. They're grim topics. And so it's no fault of the church for not wanting to look at those topics. What if a kid dies? That's a worse nightmare. And so that's where attorneys come in alongside you. And we're used to seeing these worst case scenarios all the time. We can walk through what to expect and how to put policies in place without necessarily overwhelming a church or their staff with topics that are incredibly grim.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Thank you for handling that so well. And just I know that's a very sensitive topic. The thing that I think might really help is let's say, what are some things that ministry should be thinking about as those protections for specifically children and for keeping themselves out of heavy litigation? What are some really low-hanging fruit that you see that ministries can participate in, that they can shore up, whether that's whatever those things may be? Could you maybe give us like the top 3 things a ministry could do to keep themselves safe in these instances?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the key things would be just taking away from that situation, informing parents, make sure they understand what their child is participating in. And you can do that in part through, maybe a newsletter or just at least having the parents show up on the day of. One place I don't think is a good place to inform parents is in the waiver that they're not going to read. That's an important distinction. I was talking about this morning, actually, how often do we all scroll through terms and conditions and click I accept and go? That's 32 pages of legal documents in most instances that we're just whizzing through in 12 seconds. I mean, it's just, we really just gloss over it. And so all of that to say, when you're handing a parent a permission slip day of when they're dropping their kid off, or maybe even sending it to them via a DocuSign, let's be realistic, they're not reading through those nuances. They're not appreciating those nuances. So even something like, I saw a church do this recently. It was a great program. They offered a surf camp. And there's a lot of churches in California that do that. That's a really cool outreach. It's a cool way to get kids involved. And what better place to have a sermon than on the beach, right? At the end of the day, that's really just a cool environment. And so they went and they gave newsletters in advance, just talking, hey, just so you know, this is. I know you're all Californians, telling you sharks, jellyfish, all these things don't exist. You're aware of it. You've probably been stung by one, or you know someone who's been stung by one. But really, just kind of that overarching disclaimer of what the kid was participating in, what some of the risks were. That way, when they got to the event and they signed a waiver, which I'm kind of blending these two together, but a waiver would be second. When they got to the event and they were signing the waiver, they weren't guessing it to what they were signing away. They knew exactly what they were signing away. And the third one, which I think I see, is just a poor utilization of insurance. And what I mean by that is twofold. Insurance in general can be a really good benefit for churches, and I know some people don't see the wisdom in getting some more diverse insurance. However, particularly smaller churches, there's larger churches that have a very robust insurance plans. I think business interruption insurance definitely came into play a lot for a lot of churches during COVID. However, it's in driving, in those field trips, in the school field trips, we're going to this event as a youth ministry. Let's have these people drive, or let's have Johnny drive. He just got his license. He's 18. It's not provisional anymore. Without understanding things like, is the driver qualified? If something comes up, how did you document even what their license number is? How do you know what car they were driving? If the car was insured, was the church an additional insured? These are all ways that I have seen churches kind of come up with some questionable liability that I don't think pastors are thinking through. Again, you hope Johnny can drive well. If you're packing him in a car full of 6 kids in a van, sending him up to Mammoth for a ski weekend, well, those roads are incredibly dangerous, right? And so understanding kind of how to protect the church in those circumstances, and not only the church, but the kids, right? If the kids have medical bills, their families have medical bills, they're going to be looking at the church, and if the church doesn't have a very deep pocket or a very large war chest, I say war chest, that's the attorney coming out. We refer to all savings as war chests because that's how we view it, but I guess a large savings for these types of incidents, then insurance is really going to be covering those families and making sure that they're getting back to being not only a part of your church and your congregation, but a part of your community, right?
Yeah, it seems like that is a very strategic way to continue relationship. You don't want to damage, giving a family into an extreme amount of debt because they're having to pay out of pocket for, injuries that occurred at church time. So that makes a lot of sense. So as a relational, keeping relational equity is huge at Kingdom One. So thank you for highlighting that because that is really, really important. As we talk about it, and you're really overarching, this conversation is about safety. It really is about safety. And I think it's become a hot topic amongst churches now, specifically, like we've seen some high profile church shootings, and those are continuing to happen, and media coverage of abuse, and is painting that terrible picture for ministries. How can ministries legally protect themselves and be safeguarded against this in a legal perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things we're seeing a lot right now is concerns over safety, right? How do churches respond to that? I like what one church did recently, and I think that was one I was working with was they had a very interesting approach to it. And I'll say this as a starter. Many pastors use their congregants for their security team, whether they have a CCW, whether they are a law enforcement officer off duty, whether they are maybe a former military who has offered to step up in a capacity that doesn't carry a lethal firearm. And maybe it's a ministry that has broadened that even further to using non-lethal approaches. I've seen ministries try to use tasers. I've seen ministries try to use forms of pepper spray. And I think the important thing to understand there for pastors is while all of these individuals have very good intentions, they are not covered and immune under their government statuses. They are your congregants, so they're going to be acting as civilians in a whole new set of civil laws. And they should not, under any circumstances, be used to replace actual police responses. And there's a bunch of reasoning for this. I could talk about this for an hour, but really what it comes down to is creating a good safety and security policy with things kind of like I referred to earlier, a liaison. Who from your security team at each service is going to be the point of contact to work with the police department if a response is needed? Even at a more kind of gritty but gruesome level, if you're using a non-lethal, like a taser, well, tasers maim. And if you're familiar with, I don't know how familiar you are with tasers, I had the benefit of training with some U.S. Marshals in a past life, and we got very familiar with tasers. And so they have these little prongs, and if you remove them as a congregant and cause some sort of injury, who's liable for it? Right? So it's policies like, hey, if you are using that type of non-lethal, what are the policies that are covering that? If you have somebody who's using a baton, for example, there's a ton of safety for batons and guidelines as to where you can and can't hit without potentially maiming that individual or killing them, right? And so from the perspective of safety in churches, I think having congregants involved is incredibly important, and it's a very good tool that churches can have, but really emphasizing the need for policies that govern that in a meaningful way, and then training on that. Really, that's something I see churches that don't emphasize a once-a-month training. You have congregants who come out, and you have maybe the sheriff who goes and shoots 3 times a week. You have maybe the gun advocate who shoots every other weekend in thousands of rounds. And then you have, the individual who isn't familiar with a gun at all, isn't comfortable being around a gun, is using maybe a non-lethal approach, and who won't know what to even do with it if they pick one up from somebody who brought it in with the intent to do harm. And so trainings and policies putting into place for your congregants is really the thing I think most churches can benefit from. Consulting with professionals in that, and not only, I'll condition this and I'll say in advance, I come from a family of law enforcement. I understand what they do. I appreciate what they do. Not every law enforcement officer is qualified to give advice on an active shooter situation. And many times, these guys, while I love what they do for our community and I highly respect them, they aren't trained to shoot in crowds, where you have congregants running out the door, where you have congregants all over the place, and simply knowing the trajectory of a firearm and the round is not going to always cover that. And so consulting with good professionals who are trained in those circumstances. One of my favorite stories to emphasize that is one of my friends is incredibly well trained. He was on a specialized fugitive apprehension team. He has trained SWAT teams. He's responded to some of the most notorious shootings in the state of California. And so he went to Disneyland one time with his family, wearing his firearm. At the time, I think he thought nothing of it. For him, it's just a run-of-the-mill. He always wore it everywhere, right? And the security guard came up to him and they said, "Hey, we know, step aside here. We know you're armed. We have no issue with it. Thank you for trying to protect your family." But they said, "Look, it's just too much of a liability. Look at the people around here. Look at the thousands of people. Are you really trained to shoot in an environment like this?" And even him, with all of that experience, he said, "No, probably not." And that's the same, depending on your church size. There's a lot of individuals who aren't prepared to even craft a plan or a thought process that could fully include all those possibilities in a policy. So consulting with a professional who actually knows what that looks like, who's maybe been around those incidents or studied those incidents, is important. And I don't want to shy away at the same time from saying, look, you're a church. I understand the reality that sometimes you have to use the resources that are available to you. So I'm not saying anything negative about law enforcement. I love all the guys who go out there and serve our communities. If you have to use them, by all means, that is the better than nothing, right? Don't do nothing. I didn't take away from this of, that lawyer on the podcast, he said you should consult with a professional. So I don't have the money for a professional right now. Let's do nothing. That's not it either. That's not a winning strategy. But certainly kind of just walking through that world and putting policies in place to address those types of incidents is where I think churches could really excel.
We were so excited to have Cody with us live at our Grow Together conference, and you did not miss out because you can still access all the Grow Together content today at academy.kingdom1.co. It's so important that you continue to inspire your ministry leaders to stay sharp, to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to learning. Let's be honest, there's no continuing education for Christian ministry, and we realize that. So we wanted to fill the gap to make sure that no matter where you sat within the organization, whether you're a people leader or a senior leader in HR, finance, marketing, communications, or safety team, we have something for you at the Grow Together conference. Again, you can access all of those great learnings today by going to academy.kingdom1.co. I love how you kind of position this to there's a good way to handle this and there's a better way to handle this. And so having those better options of knowing which way to go and having our audience, make some of those decisions for themselves, but also consulting. It would also, maybe offline we could talk about some of the services that you think ministries could partake of and that very well, because that would be, I know we would probably get those questions of like, I want to know who in the state of California or who in the state of Texas, because as we are in Texas as well, and this is an issue in Texas as well, and pretty much across all the U.S. It would be great to maybe have a couple of names and numbers just to, for the sake of ministry leaders to call and understand that they're not alone in this.
Absolutely. And reach out offline. I have some contacts I can send your way that we can put the listeners in contact with people. I work primarily in California, so a lot of my contacts are in California, but I do have several contacts in Texas, kind of small world, but perfect in this instance.
That's awesome. Wanting to transition the conversation a bit and still thinking about liability, still thinking about safety. And this is something that I'm really excited to have the conversation because you're one of the first, I would say, leaders in our community who has wanted to tackle this subject. And not many people are willing to talk about transgender identity in church. I don't know if they think that ignoring the issue is going to help. But let's just talk from a legal perspective. Can you help our ministry leaders out about protections and recommendations on legally handling transgender issues that may arise on campus?
Yeah, that's a really important topic right now. And I'll start by saying, I think it's important to acknowledge that all these people are your congregants, that all these individuals are still beautifully made in the image of God, and that it's important to never discriminate against anyone, regardless of maybe your personal beliefs about them. So with that context, I think it's important to lay that out. I'm not encouraging that you discriminate against anyone. I'm just encouraging you to use your resources to conduct outreaches within the church that are well-crafted. And so we'll dive into that a little bit. I think some of the things churches can do that will help is create a statement of faith, revise their statement of faith, and revisit it. While, again, and maybe I should take a step back. And I think it's probably wise because I'm going to reference something throughout this. Nick, are you familiar with what a ministerial exception is?
Yes, I am, but we do get that question quite often, so it'd be great to hear you explain it to the audience at large.
So I'm going to keep it at 1,000-point view because it's a unique carve-out that really is fact-specific. And I've seen instances, there's case law that goes back. I know there was a larger case in 2012 where they talked about that in respect to teachers, and this is something that comes up routinely in cases, is really what is a minister? And it's so fact-specific. Are they claiming a minister exemption on their taxes? Are they teaching the scripture? Are they trained in the scripture? Are they trained to lead a sermon or a Bible study? Or is the material that you're presenting to your congregants so interwoven with scripture that they're necessarily one and the same, right? These aren't legal standards. I'm trying to put the legal standards in plain English, so don't run out and be like, well, he said. No, there's a lot of nuance to this, right? And so, in short, what it does is it allows churches to pick their clergy, right? It allows churches to pick their leaders and ensure that what their leadership is promoting is consistent with the church's beliefs as founded in Scripture. And so I'll use the example, and again, it's nothing towards a particular congregation, but a Christian church would not necessarily want a Catholic priest to come in and be their head pastor. And I think that a Catholic church would probably have quite a few issues with a Christian pastor coming into their church and being like, yeah, let's do this, let's talk, and being the leader of their congregation. There's nothing wrong with either of those beliefs, and I'm not here to make an opinion on either one of those, but that's what it does. It allows churches to pick their leaders. Now, who is a leader becomes incredibly questionable. What the threshold for that is subject to interpretation. One way that a lot of attorneys approach it is call everybody a minister and just put it in the job description. I don't know that that's the greatest way to go about it. It's kind of the equivalent of throwing a Band-Aid on an issue, but understanding the need for crafting a good job description that's individually tailored to those ministers, understanding that there is a time and place to use that appropriately. And I know I'm going to get an email from this from one of my colleagues because they're going to be like, no, Cody, I disagree with that. But I do think that there's a distinction between a Sunday school teacher and maybe, Susan, who volunteers once a week to work just the paperwork in the office. She's not leading. She's not teaching. It is a difference. And I do think while there are circumstances where Susan can be rendered a minister, those are very fact specific. And again, that goes towards that idea that you have to treat each employee, each volunteer. I say volunteer. Volunteers wouldn't even apply for this, so I apologize. Each employee with that really uniquely tailored approach. All that to be said, crafting a statement of faith that addresses some of these hot topics in society is important, because when you do hire that minister and when you do look towards making employment decisions relating to that minister, a good statement of faith, which addresses things like the LGBTQIA community, or transgender individuals, or beliefs on even marriage within the confines of the church. Those are important things to be able to point to from a legal perspective to address it and say, look, we understand, we love you, but here's our statement of faith, here's what we need our leaders to be, kind of moving forward for our congregation. So I think that's one thing that is missed out on. I've seen a lot of statements of faith, even recently, where I'm looking at them going, you're missing a lot here. You have the important stuff, right? God, Son, Holy Spirit, the inspired and infallible word of the Bible, right? The need for us to love one another. You have kind of those cornerstones, but you're missing things that could really protect the church when these situations arise. And so it creates more arguments than you would want. And in these instances, it's always about creating positive arguments and being able to convey those arguments in a loving and passionate way for people who, again, are equally as beautiful and created in God's image. And so that's important. And then understanding that even though a minister exception exists for ministers, it doesn't always exist in certain circumstances, like volunteers, right? Even if they're going towards a teaching position, okay, maybe they're a minister a little more, right? But again, fact specific, but really creating a intake environment for those individuals where they understand the expectations of the content that they're supposed to teach. And that's one way I think a lot of churches have been able to address these issues lately, is by providing these statements of faith. And I really like when churches do that. They provide a statement of faith. They're not attacking the individual. They're not attacking the individual's beliefs, their identity, but they're engaging with them on a very realistic approach of, look, this is what you're going to be expected to teach, and we want to make sure that you're comfortable with that. And I really liked that approach when you're dealing with these individuals who are trying genuinely to volunteer. Another way to approach this, which I do like, is to, let me just pull this up real quick. Sorry about that.
No, you're good. What I do love is how you've couched things with the Imago Dei. Like I feel that that is super important as we look at every person is created in the image, and that is very, very important how we handle that. The other thing that I really appreciate from what you're telling us is this ministerial view and what those boundaries are. That's very, very helpful for us as ministry leaders. And so, yeah, also think just one more thought as you're there is clarity is key. And so for us to define what we mean by what we say is very, very important. And it is going to create a lot of arguments, as you said. But I think one thing that we need to get sharper in as ministry leaders is having the ability to have a conversation or to have a disagreement, but keeping it at the highest level possible. I used to have somebody I worked for. Her name was Betsy Bueller, and her three things was work hard, have fun, and fight fair. And I thought in ministry that's really weird to talk about fighting fair within ministry. And then it really dawned on me that as we begin to really get sharp within our leadership, we do have to engage in some healthy conflict. So I commend you for engaging in that. Like we are going to have some healthy conflict in order to define the terms that's going to eventually keep us safe in ministry.
Yeah, and it's an important to further that. I think one of the ways to fight fair is to make sure that you're not discriminating in those conversations. One thing that I saw recently, which I wasn't too happy with, is while they were having this, they were following a policy for how to address individuals who wanted to volunteer, and it was uniformly applied. It wasn't being created in response to any one person's inquiry. But during the process, they were using gender roles that were not appropriate. They were calling this individual a male when they preferred to identify as a female. And they were using names that they preferred. I think it's called dead naming. Look, I understand your personal beliefs, but for many individuals, those can still be discrimination. And there's ways that the church can interact again in better ways with those individuals without making them feel attacked, right? To your point, fighting fair, I know churches have a very strong biblically grounded belief when it comes to these topics, and it is still about fighting fair at the end of the day, right? You don't need to attack the person personally in order to obtain the goals that you want. You don't have to agree with their mindset. Have policies in place that are equally applied, have statements of faith and expectations that are clearly defined so people understand. And then when it comes down to it, when you really come up with some of these instances, consult with an attorney. That's a little self-serving as a plug, and I get that. I'm not saying consult with me, consult with your own attorney. Consult with any attorney. Because what I have found is that there are organizations out there which are sending people to churches to volunteer, and they're trying to get standing. And that's really what it is. And for those who might not be familiar with standing, that's the right to sue. This happens frequently in many realms. Church is one realm where I see it more often than not. And I love the topic to describe standing as somebody who actually has a harm. And so there's an old case about elephants. And all these women came together. They thought, I really want to see an elephant in Africa someday. We should sue the government to do something so I can preserve that right in the future. Well, the government said, you've never been to Africa. You might not ever go. You might not have the economic capacity to go, so you don't have standing. You're not actually being harmed by this. And so what companies and these organizations have started doing is sending individuals out to essentially test the waters, audit churches, if you will. And so when you see situations arise that are maybe a little more adversarial right off the bat, or maybe individuals entering who aren't congregants, maybe consult with an attorney sooner rather than later to see if you have one of those situations on your hand.
That's great. I love how there is a spectrum of situation that you talked about, that, being very intentional about using, like as we address individuals, we want to make sure we're addressing them with the utmost respect. And at the same time, understanding that there are people who could potentially be out there who are trying to sue or to put the church in a liability situation. So it's very, very good to hear from you on that. I think we might have touched on a couple of things. We might have touched on, as we talked about statement of faith and that. Can you also maybe speak to the idea of handbooks? Because I know those sometimes get taken into account, specifically around hiring and and potentially turnover, firing for a ministry. Is there a correlation between handbooks and hiring and dismissal firing procedures?
Yeah, so that's a great segue because one of the important parts of handbooks is to include your policies, right? Include those non-discrimination policies, include those identification of protections, not only about some of these hot button issues, but even in California about hairstyles, right? And the need to be sensitive to individuals' hairstyles and not discriminate in that. It's not to say that you can't make some questions about people when they come in with hot pink hair. I once had bright green hair at one point in time, and I certainly understand the effect that can have on people. But yes, handbooks are important for hiring. They're important for firing, but they're important to let people know the expectation of the company. And this is actually something I addressed recently at the Grow Together conference. We talked through handbooks and we talked through severances, which kind of go hand in hand, right? And so handbooks, I would say the key things to keep in mind with handbooks are they are a place for policies where your employees should be able to go, where they should be able to understand the expectations, where they should be able to understand who to contact in certain situations. And they are able to understand their benefits, how they can use sick leave, how they can use vacation time, or what their rights are when a family member close to them passes away, right? And so that's what a handbook should be. What should not be in a handbook is overarching company policies. What should not be in a handbook is a breakdown of every single job description in the entirety of the church. What should not be in a handbook is a huge arbitration provision that's tucked in there in 0.8 font. I've seen that. I don't understand it, but what the handbook needs to be that. It needs to be a handbook. Similarly, if you have employment concerns, you should put those in agreements, right? If you have employment concerns at the end, they need to be in a severance agreement. Again, it's just not the right place for a lot of those policies, and I'll use an example. I saw a handbook once that was 3 pages. It was missing almost everything. And Nick, I'm sure Kingdom One sees handbooks all the time. I said 3 pages. I saw your face change. You can understand that half of the first page was probably the table of contents and the cover. And so 3 pages, that definitely did not cover the church. We needed more information in there. We needed more of that delineation of benefits as to some of those employment policies. And I'll distinguish that. I said policies earlier. Company policies should not be in the handbook. Employment policies should. You can have a separate policies and procedures. By all means, I encourage it. Hand it to the employees at the same time. But where I hate seeing it is when you have an employee or a most knowledgeable person in a deposition, and they're going through your handbook, and because relevance isn't an objection in a deposition. I've seen that used in terrible ways. I've seen that used to just harass people in depositions. But it always throws people off when they start getting obscure questions about company policies that they weren't expecting. And it's all fair game because it's all in this world of a handbook that they're talking through, right? And so separating out what needs to be in a policy and procedure versus what needs to be an employee-facing policy is important. And so on the other side of that, I saw a handbook once that was 112 pages. And yeah, that pretty much had anything and everything under the sun in it. It was confidentiality. It defined trade secrets for like 3 pages. It talked about like California law and copyright and common law copyright when it came to the creation of works for hire, because all Sunday school teachers were technically employees at that point in time. And so it was a work for hire where all of their sermons, all their prep materials were the property of the church. It went on for a long time and covered, I'm using that as an example because it was the most out of place. But it really did cover kind of a shocking amount of things that should never be in an employee handbook. And we trimmed that one down to about 30 pages, which was much more reasonable. So again, just crafting a handbook that sets those expectations, that isn't over-inclusive, but at the same time, please, if yours is 3 pages, go talk to an HR company, talk to Kingdom One. They'll point you in a better direction. And so that's an important part, but to stay a little more on topic, it's an important point to ensure that your employees are getting the proper information as to non-discrimination and how to interact with even individuals in the LGBTQIA community, right? And so it's another good opportunity to educate individuals on their obligations as employees of the church, educate people as to their mission statement, their statement of faith, 2 things that should be in there, in my opinion, should be on the front page, actually. And it gives employees, again, that expectation. What should I expect to work? Like Kingdom One. If I went to Kingdom One, I would love an employee handbook to tell me exactly what to expect, what you guys' beliefs are, what you guys are founded in, what your mission statement is, where we're going as a community, what I'm working towards. Those are the things that should be in an employee handbook, not necessarily the nuances of a terms and conditions, right?
Absolutely. I think that's such a great point is, if it's too small, it's kind of like the Goldilocks effect. If it's not there, it's not effective. If it's overloaded, it's not going to work either. And so I think you're right, is finding that proper amount of what policy for employees needs to be there. And yes, Kingdom One definitely does do that. And as we wrap today, I just wanted to ask the question: how and when should somebody contact you? Because I think, we don't want everybody just contacting you for just little nuanced questions of like, my employee handbook's 32 and a half pages. Is that enough? I just want to make sure we're stewarding your time, but at the same time, how can we get in touch with you, and at what point should a ministry leader think about contacting legal support?
Yeah, so I don't know what you guys do for the perspective of, if you have newsletters or something, we can always coordinate to send something out with my contact information in it. But generally, you can give my firm a call. My firm's Bellmeyer Law. Set up a consult. We'll have a time to sit down, and we'll have an opportunity to talk through not just one thing, but maybe a gambit of issues or a variety of issues that are affecting your church. We can look at your employee handbook. We can look at your severance agreements. We can look at your policies. We can look at your mission statement. We can look at your bylaws and how those interact with it. We can really take a look at just the legal health of your church, if you will. Similar to how you would go in and you would see your general practitioner once a year. Hey, I need to check my blood. Hey, my leg hurts when I do this. Doc, my neck kind of feels funny, right? I would say it's about the same frequency you need to go see an attorney, probably once a year, right after your fiscal year. For some schools, that's summer. For others, that's after tax season makes the most sense. Others is early year, or in some instances around the holiday season, like November, so they can prepare for the coming year. But I would say no matter what, talk to an attorney once a year just to get that church health, right? Maybe something happened that you weren't aware with. Maybe a case came down and it changes the way you should practice. I'm talking to attorneys. Apologies. The way you should preach, the way you should go about interacting with your congregants. And so I would say at least once a year, I would talk with an attorney. If you ever get a legal letter, you should talk with an attorney of any sort. That's another thing I see frequently is individuals get legal letters. This isn't exclusive to churches. I see this all the time in a bunch of different industries. They get a legal letter. They go, this is a lie. This is made up. I can deal with this very quickly. And then when they're served with the complaint and have an answer due in a day, they call me like, so I probably should have told you this 3 months ago. And that's definitely way too far gone. The other thing, which I think is really a good kind of gauge to determine when you need to talk to an attorney, is to utilize Kingdom One. Really, you guys do an excellent job at saying, hey, this needs an attorney, or hey, this is HR side, we can deal with this. Let's guide you through this process. It'll be cheaper than an attorney. But you guys do a great job at really telling individuals when to escalate, in my experience. Things that require maybe complete overhaul to your bylaws, get an attorney. You have an employee who chases another employee around the workplace with a knife, probably need an attorney. You have a kid who dies somewhere on your campus, yesterday. You needed an attorney yesterday. So kind of a scale, if you will, based on severity, based on the challenges of your church. But in any event, I think it's wise for any church, or even outside of churches. I work a lot with businesses. Any business, and churches are businesses at the end of the day, any nonprofit, any school, maybe outreaches that are aimed at also nonprofits, but aren't churches and are aimed at the community. I know there's several that you guys service. Reach out to an attorney once a year just to make sure that your business is in good health. Because when it's not, you could end up paying a lot more. I know attorneys are scary because of prices. I'll note a lot of attorneys like myself have nonprofit rates, so it's not as scary as you'd think. But go pay an attorney $25 once a year, $50 once a year to go through and just look at everything. And you'll be happier for it. Otherwise, you're going to be paying about 10 to 20 on the back end to have them fix it. It's not really worth it.
Yep, absolutely. Agreed. And thank you for pointing back to Kingdom One, because this is something that we do, and it is something that we handle. I will also say legal updates in November are always a great way to stay ahead of the curve for the upcoming year. That's something that we do, and I'm sure we'll be partnering together in legal updates for the future. Kingdom One fam, thank you for listening to another podcast. I was so grateful to have this conversation with Cody. You can see all of his information in the show notes or the description wherever you're listening or watching this podcast at. And I also want to let you know that it is through the giving of people like you that you make this podcast possible. It is through your giving that you are giving to this big idea of a mission of courageous, healthy, and effective ministry leaders who are leaving an impact on the world. This is so important to us, and we take those dollars that you give and we invest back into trainings, into tools, into some knowledge, resources, and communities that are going to make sure that the next generation of leaders are equipped for the task of leading the church. If you want to give today, you can go to kingdomone.co/give. And I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart from whatever amount you give, because your generosity makes the Kingdom One podcast and other things that Kingdom One does possible. Thank you so very much. If you have any questions for us, you can reach out to us at hello@kingdomone.co. And if you realized, hey, I need to get in touch with somebody from Kingdom One because there's something that's keeping me up at night, there is something that came across my desk and I don't know how to tackle it alone, you are not alone. You can go to kingdomone.co/get-started today, and we can have a conversation so you can rest assured that you can get back to the ministry that you love. Thanks so much. Till we chat again, let's grow the church together.